This panel, as Dan noted, is now to take a look at the developments we've just been talking about, but from a regional perspective. We have three panelists. First, Ambassador Kim Beazley, Australian ambassador to the U.S. He has been ambassador here since February of 2010. He served for 25 years in the Australian government. I think the short list would be of the ministerial portfolios that he has not had over the course of that time. An extraordinary career. In addition, has been Chancellor of Australian National University. He will start off and will set the overall regional framework for views about Japan's new security posture, and also make some particular comments, I assume, about the Australian relationship with Japan. Followed by General Chip Gregson, currently Senior Director for China and the Pacific at the Center for the National Interest, but he has held a series of leading positions in the U.S. military in Northeast Asia, especially Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs, Commanding General of the Marine Corps Forces, Pacific and Maritime Corps Forces in Central Command, and so forth. Again, a long list. Marvin Ott, Senior Scholar, Asia Program of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, also an adjunct professor and research scholar at SAIS. We have had relatively limited time for Q&A in each of the sessions to date because this whole thing has gotten a little bit behind time. We have a very hard stop at 12:30 for this panel. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to come up simply in turn. And then at the end of that, we'll move very quickly to Q&A from the audience. I think we've had a total of one or two questions from the audience to this point. We'll try to make up for that a bit by giving you an opportunity to raise the issues that are most concerned to you. Let me begin by asking Ambassador Beazley to come to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ken and Admiral Blair, and my colleagues on the panel. I'm flattered to be part of such a distinguished panel here and before such a distinguished audience. As Ken said, I want to talk a bit about the regional context and also a bit about Australian-Japanese bilateral relations, because I think we're a bit of a test study of how the Japanese can relate to countries in the region and the opportunities and possibilities that are there for them as they do that. I was thinking back over the 4 years that I've been ambassador here, just about a year or two before I came here, when I was sort of reading myself into the job, and thinking how extraordinarily changed the strategic environment in Asia has become over that period of time. When I arrived here, I was remonstrated with very strongly by the NSC, by the Pentagon, or more particularly by the State Department, that an idea that an Australian Prime Minister had put out there for a collective Asia-Pacific organisation somewhat like the EU was a stupid course for Australia to pursue, that we were talking above ourselves, and that folk in the region were deeply mistrustful of us, and we ought to think again. You also noted that the conversation at the time was about the prospect of withdrawal of substantial numbers of American armed forces from Japan to Guam and Hawaii. There was very much on the agenda was the transfer of wartime operational control from the US to the ROK in Korea, and of course many years before that US forces had left the Philippines. What a change. What an extraordinary change there has been in the environment over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. Now we're moving in the zone that we're most concerned with here to the most comprehensive ballistic missile defence system, multinational missile defence system anywhere on Earth. We have the OPCON transfer under review. We have progress towards a long-term solution for the Marines on Okinawa. We have an agreement reached with the Philippines on an enhanced rotation of the US military presence in the area. And Prime Minister Abe has put the US alliance at the centre of his foreign policy. That is a transformed situation. Well, what's been the catalyst for that change? I think firstly, there's been a recognition in the United States that the Asia-Pacific zone is the key zone geopolitically, largely driven by economic factors, and it is also an area of the globe that most fits the central character of American military power. American military power is first and foremost maritime power, and it's a region where that really counts. So there's, in the first instance, a very substantial advantage to the United States and an absolute necessity for the United States to engage itself more heavily in the region. Secondly, there is the emergence of North Korea as a serious potential nuclear threat, and to the Asia-Pacific generally, but also, of course, to the United States. And that is a major driver of US policy now in North Asia. And then thirdly, the temperature of territorial disputes in Northeast and Southeast Asia has increased significantly. And in that process, there has become uncertainty about how China, as it becomes even stronger, will approach the resolution of those disputes. Now, Australia, like the United States, Japan, and most countries in the region, want to engage China in a close and constructive friendship. China is a great power. It is absolutely critical to global prosperity, and it has to be dealt with on the basis of respect. And all countries in the region are working out how that ought to be done. But as we are committed to promoting the rules-based international order that enables the prosperity for us all, we also voice our concerns clearly when we think that these are at risk. The logic and rhythm of power politics in the Indo-Pacific region leads us to the view that stability is best served if all players are able to participate in collective security arrangements, and that includes Japan. Now, the Australia-Japan partnership is our closest and the most mature in the region. Relationship is fundamentally important to both countries. It's important to both countries' strategic and economic interests. It had it as its beginnings with the establishment of a major trading relationship shortly after World War II, formalised by the 1957 Commerce Agreement, and has become broader and deeper ever since. Prime Minister Abbott visited Tokyo on the 7th of April, and he and Prime Minister Abe agreed to elevate the strategic partnership between Japan and Australia to, quote, a new special relationship based on our values and interests, particularly those values and interests which we share: democracy, human rights, the rule of law, open markets and free trade. They also agreed a new Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, and that agreement is the most significant deal done between the two countries since the original 1957 agreement. But what is new is that Japan is increasingly seen in Australia as a viable security partner. This has come about through familiarity born of experience and exposure to cooperation over recent years. The Japanese Self-Defence Forces and the ADF worked together in Iraq, where Japanese engineers were located concurrent with Australian infantry elements. Japan also contributed to UNMISET in East Timor. We worked together in Cambodia and doing so now in South Sudan. Most recently, Australia and Japan both worked closely alongside the United States in providing disaster assistance in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, where past exercises together aimed at building interoperability were put for the first time to practical use. That the United States is the most important strategic ally of both Australia and Japan helps the affinity. We have a well-established trilateral cooperation track with Japan and the US through the trilateral strategic dialogue between foreign ministers, and defence ministers also regularly meet trilaterally, as do defence officials through the Security and Defence Cooperation Forum. Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Abe agreed to elevate the bilateral security and defence relationship to a, quote, new level, building on the 2007 Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation and reflecting the recent growth in defence cooperation. And that's including further expanding combined defence training and improved interoperability. The PM has tasked foreign and defence ministers at the next 2+2 meeting in June to develop ways to enhance practical bilateral defence cooperation. We also plan to deepen cooperation on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maritime security, peacekeeping and capacity building. The PM has also decided to begin negotiating a framework agreement for cooperation on defence science, technology and equipment. We'll start with joint research on marine hydrodynamics. Ultimately, there is a lot that Australia and Japan can do for each other and with each other. For example, Prime Minister Abbott noted this month that Japan has the largest and most capable conventional submarines in the world. As he said, Australia would like to learn, wherever possible, from Japan's experience as we develop the next generation of our own submarines. In short, Australia welcomes Japan's recent efforts on its security policy and looks forward to Japan continuing to make a proactive contribution to peace, as Prime Minister Abe puts it. Of course, in taking these changes forward, it will be important to observe regional sensitivities. Japan's transparent and consultative approach to changes in its security policy is important for the region and most welcome. Well, it's an extraordinary thing when you sit down and take a look at how that build-up of military cooperation has occurred between Australia and Japan. It's a product of a substantial change, I think, in Japanese views as to what they're prepared to do into outreach with their friends, but it also represents a finalisation, if you like, of a sea change in Australian perspectives on Japan. I mean, when you think that the last century began with Japan identified as Australia's principal potential enemy and ended with it as Japan no stronger partner in the Asia-Pacific region for Japan, from within the region that is, of course, the United States supplants all that. And it's important also to remember the origins of the Australian-American relationship. The people think the ANZUS alliance is part of the US extended deterrence system negotiated through Europe and Asia. Let me let you into a nasty little secret. It wasn't. The ANZUS alliance was opposed by the American military at the time on the grounds that the Australian region was irrelevant to the United States. The Australians said to the United States, "You want us to sign a peace treaty with Japan? You negotiate an agreement with us." So there was a different context for the creation of ANZUS at the time. That context has completely disappeared, and also the rationale in Australian policy that produced that piece of toughness with the United States at that point. Thanks very much.
Oh, good morning. I'm Chip Gregson. Thank you to Sasakawa Peace Foundation for allowing me to participate today. Congratulations to my good friend and former boss, Admiral Blair, on his new position. And it's always a great pleasure to share time with Australia's wonderful ambassador to the United States. It's also equally a challenge to follow Australia's wonderful ambassador to the United States to the speaker's platform, but I'll try not to ruin Australian-Japan relations in my brief 10 minutes here. I'm enjoying being a former official because I enjoy much more freedom to travel to Asia now than I did when I was in office. I also enjoy much better access to officials in various countries because as a member of the private sector now, nobody's bound by protocol. We don't have to have 15 handlers in a room or a lawyer to watch over our conversation. I've traveled recently to Singapore, to Thailand, to Taiwan, to the Philippines prior to the typhoon, and to Vietnam. And in all these countries, got a good sense of how people view Japan's new security posture, Japan's new security relations, and it's all very good. The Philippine visit, for example, was in company with a Japanese Diet member. We enjoyed a small dinner with the defense minister. No concerns at all were expressed about Japan's security posture. The whole conversation was about projects in mutual interest. The visit to Vietnam most recently was the third in a continuing series of trilateral U.S.-Japan-Vietnam dialogue. U.S. treats it as a Track 2 dialogue. Japan treats it as a Track 2 dialogue. Vietnam treats it as Track 1. This dialogue is, by the way, sponsored by Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the Center for Global Progress from Japan. So thanks to both institutions for that. One of the members of the Japanese delegation at this trilateral discussion was a person that many of you know, retired Admiral Koji Yoda. He was able to make a presentation during the trilateral dialogue. He was so compelling in the presentation that the Vietnamese went to him afterwards privately. They sent the rest of us home at the scheduled end of the trilateral dialogue. They kept Admiral Koda for another 3 days to talk to many other officials in Vietnam, including their defense academy. So relations with that are very, very good. Typhoon Haiyan response on behalf of Japan. Japan created immediate pledges and immediate provision of substantial aid. The disaster response included a major deployment of Japanese disaster response experts, non-governmental officials, and a major self-defense force deployment. One of the largest self-defense force deployments in history since the creation of the self-defense force. 3 capital ships and over 1,000 troops providing aid directly to the Philippines. It was necessarily a joint operation because it included elements of the major elements of the maritime and the ground self-defense force. This is of a piece with the Japanese formation of 3 combined headquarters in the aftermath of 3/11 to help manage the recovery from the 3/11 disaster. This is important in the context of what we're talking about with collective defense. It's absolutely impossible, in my opinion, with today's weapons technology, the nature of today's threat, to do this any other way. It has to be close and continuous integration. This is not remilitarization of Japan. This is not anything else except effective alliance defense of Japan. UN support. Japan has been a substantial contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, second largest financial contributor. Past troop contributions to UN peacekeeping operations include Cambodia, Mozambique, the Golan Heights, Timor-Leste, and Japan is currently deployed in Darfur. Foreign direct investment across Asia, Japan is a generous and continuous contributor to development. This year's coming up Pacific Partnership exercise. Pacific Partnership, as you know, is a naval contribution of the United States. It's in its 9th year now, almost a decade old, very popular, bringing humanitarian aid to various countries in Asia. This year, for the first time, the command ship will be a Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force vessel. The commander will be American, the vice commander will be Japanese, the chief of staff will be an Australian officer. So yes, as Ambassador Beasley just said, a viable strategic and operational partner. Japan is back, the alliance is back, and the alliance is growing. Thank you very much.
I'll echo others and say it's a great pleasure to be here. I'll also echo Ambassador Beasley referring to the strategic landscape in East Asia. What a change. My own two biases underlying that perception are that the change, the strategic change, the geopolitical change is being driven almost entirely by China, China's growing capability, China's growing strategic ambition. And my other bias is that a great deal of the focus, I'm tempted to say almost ground zero, of the strategic competition that is emerging in the region is in Southeast Asia. So it's a pleasure for me to be able to highlight my favorite and neglected region for just a couple of minutes. I'm tempted to start with just a quick metaphor. Japan's relationship with Southeast Asia, certainly as viewed from Southeast Asia, is a little bit like one of those Arctic vistas that stayed frozen and beautiful and unchanging for a very long time. We're talking decades. And then sometime about 15 years ago or so, the very sensitive instrumentation began to detect some initial changes in atmospheric temperature. But the landscape remained visually unchanged. But in the last very few years, we're starting to see the ice beginning to fracture. The changes in temperature are becoming quite demonstrable, and we're seeing a new landscape emerge. Now, the process is still, particularly with regard to Japan and the region, in its early stages. It's not at all clear whether the ice will break sufficiently to allow transport through this area, or what the new landscape will look like, but clearly something very profound is happening. Now, just a word of backdrop should be noted, it's familiar to everyone in the room. The historical legacy, attitudinal legacy that Japan inherits with regard to Southeast Asia is very, very different from the familiar landscape and rather toxic landscape that Japan has inherited and deals with in Northeast Asia. Remember that in Southeast Asia, the leaderships of two major countries, Myanmar and Indonesia, emerged out of the Japanese occupation and were in fact enabled by that occupation. Thailand remained neutral during the war. The resistance to Japanese occupation in Malaya at the time was confined largely to the Chinese ethnic population that saw the struggle as an extension of what was going on in China. And it was really only in Singapore and in the Philippines where you had anything like what could have become a bitter legacy from the war. And in both countries, very strikingly, the decision was made long ago not to forget, not necessarily to forgive, but to move on. And the receptivity in both countries and in the region as a whole to a rising and role for Japan has been there for a very long time. Having said that, Japan's role in the region has been very monodimensional. Yoshida Doctrine, samurai with briefcases, Japan's role as an economic engine, ODA, investment, trade, is all familiar. It was an extremely important part of the rise, the dramatic transformation of Southeast Asia, the mini tigers, whatever metaphor you want to use, that saw growth rates in the 7.5%, 8.5% GDP year on year, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and so on. The transformation that the World Bank in 1993 referred to as the Asian miracle, a lot of that was enabled by and driven by Japan's economic role in the region. And that role remained, again, monodimensional and economic. There was at least one voice in the region that looked for more than that. Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad, Malaysia's idiosyncratic prime minister, long time, came into office advocating a look east policy that envisioned Japan as the leader of an increasingly cohesive, assertive Asian bloc that would stand up against Western influence and Western blocs embodied by the EU and NAFTA. Dr. Mahathir found little receptivity in Tokyo for this particular vision of political leadership. And in fact, to tell the truth, the Japanese economic sort of Yoshida role in the region was entirely compatible with the geostrategic landscape that we saw in the region 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. But again, back to my metaphor, by the time you get into the mid to the late 1990s, the instrumentation is showing some change in temperature. I made a visit to Tokyo in early 2001, guest of a think tank, round of visits, Skymasho, Defense Force, Ministry, journalists, and so on. And my theme at the time was, you know, China actually has very serious ambitions in Southeast Asia. The line that the Chinese draw on their maps around the South China Sea is in fact intended to be a line demarcating Chinese territory. Aren't you folks concerned about that? And the answer I got back, it surprised me a bit. I was expecting the answer to be no, not to worry. The answer I got back was, yes, we are worried. We're in fact increasingly worried, but there's nothing we can do about it, so we hope you Americans will solve the problem for us. Well, the change in geostrategic landscape that was being detected, of course, gathered momentum in the years after 2001. And by the time we get into more recent years, the benchmarks are familiar. Problems with fishermen, demarcation of zones for non-fishing by the Chinese, and increasing deployment of Chinese capable marine enforcement out into the Gulf. We had the dramatic events of the 2000 ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum meetings, where Ambassador Yang of China confronted with Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, and support from ASEAN foreign ministers, raising questions implicitly about China's intent in the South China Sea, had a kind of public meltdown. That became a sort of oh my God moment for many of the ASEAN ministers. And we have seen in the period since an increasing sort of drumbeat of incidents, perhaps most dramatically the Chinese takeover of Scarborough Shoals within the EEZ of the Philippines. This meant that when, and as part of this changing strategic landscape, of course, the pivot, the rebalance that was talked about so effectively earlier this morning, this meant that when Ambassador Abe became Prime Minister in 2012, and incidentally had a family legacy, which is well known, well publicized, but it had a Southeast Asia dimension. His grandfather, former Prime Minister Kishi, had made a trip through Southeast Asia, was the first, I think it's fair to say, Japanese Prime Minister to really call attention to Japanese interests in the region, advocated and instituted a Southeast Asia Development Fund. And when when Prime Minister Abe became Prime Minister, it became very clear right from the outset that he intended to make Southeast Asia a real focus. Within a month of having become Prime Minister, he embarked on a trip that encompassed all 10 ASEAN countries. Nothing like that had ever happened before. It was about as overt a statement of strategic intent and a recognition of the strategic importance of the region by the Japanese leadership. And the basis for that, the underlying sinews, were fairly obvious. And I'll just tick off what I think probably Ambassador Abe saw as he put together that trip. First of all, that the Japanese long economic preeminence in Southeast Asia was rapidly giving way to a Chinese replacement. China had become the dominant trade partner of virtually every country in the region, including Australia. That paradoxically, Japan's dependence on Southeast Asia economically was growing. The famous the sea lanes, 90% of Japan's energy by this time was flowing through those sea lanes through the South China Sea, 40% of Japan's total maritime trade going through the same sea lanes. In the meantime, the population, the general economic heft of the region, a population now of 620 million, a collective GDP of 2.3 trillion, high growth rates, the region to become a major investment platform for Japan. 2009 to 2011, $30 billion alone of Japanese investment goes into the region. So the region is, on the one hand, Japan is losing its economic leverage in the region at the same time that the region is gaining in economic importance. The South China Sea was increasingly seen in Tokyo as absolutely critical to Japan's survival, and Prime Minister Abe used phrases that basically put it in as stark a terms as that. And the whole Southeast Asia region was seen as an avenue of connectivity for Japan, not only to Southeast Asia, but beyond Southeast Asia into the subcontinent and to the Middle East. The result of that was a very active turn to the region, as I've just noted, and it included language that focused heavy Japanese attention on the multilateral institutional arrangements in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the ASEAN Defense Ministerials, the ASEAN Regional Forum. Prime Minister Abe used language like ASEAN is a linchpin of Japanese security policy. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that fairly quickly there was a realization in Tokyo of the limitations of what could be done through these multilateral institutional channels, and there was a new emphasis on bilateral arrangements, and I'll wrap up here in about one more minute. There's been a active, and it's an interesting story, an active agenda of a growing security presence is probably the wrong word. It's a growing security level of activity in the region by Japan that's included funding for maritime infrastructure, some of it overtly designed to support the American pivot and facilitate American military deployments, security-oriented ODA, despite great resistance in the ODA bureaucracy. Most dramatically, this has included the 10 patrol boats that have gone to the Philippines, $12 million apiece, roughly. Talk of another tranche of patrol boats going to Vietnam. There have been strategic dialogues, military-to-military exchanges, ship visits. It's been a significant evolution. Back to an earlier point about attitudes in the region, it is striking that all of this has been welcomed in Southeast Asia. There is no resistance to it. There is no constraint upon its further development except constraints that are self-imposed in Tokyo. Lots of examples of that. I'll just note that President Aquino in the Philippines has talked about the importance of Japan reinterpreting the Constitution, expanding its military capabilities, and talking about linking up Japan's capabilities with American military capabilities in the region as sort of two allies working together in joint defense of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China. Now, other leaders in Southeast Asia have been more circumspect, but it is fair to say, I think, that President Aquino is only a little bit out in front of the rest of the region. There's lots to be said about what's going on specifically bilaterally, Vietnam, Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, but my time is up, I think, and I'll wrap it at that point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. This review of views of Japan's new security posture in the region has been, as I heard it, unreservedly positive. Australia has a very supportive view and welcomes the changes in Japan's capabilities and policies, very much the same in Southeast Asia. We heard on the last panel how strongly the U.S. welcomes this. I was a little surprised on this panel not to hear more about Chinese and South Korean views of what Japan is doing and what the implications of that are. Let me ask whether any of the speakers wants to comment on that in particular, and I'm obviously looking especially at General Gregson, but please.
The Korean issues are well known. The dialogue still continues at some level between the Japanese self-defense force and the Korean military forces, while the historical issues are being worked otherwise. Chinese views are well known. China can be relied upon to object to anything that Japan does on Japan's territory as somehow an affront to Chinese position, Chinese dignity. The recent developments, the new Japanese defense guidelines are pretty extraordinary. The current alliance guidelines revisions that are underway, I think, are going to be historic, because I think we will be coming to grips with what's really important to us out there as the United States and what's really important to us as an alliance, which is the defense of the territory, the interest, and the lives of our allies and friends. It's not aimed at China, but it is, and it's not, and it's the defense posture and the strategy that I hope will come out of this Alliance Defense Guidelines review should become a powerful deterrent to avoid the conflict we're all trying to avoid. The challenges are pretty clear. China's the most rapidly rising power in world history, which adds an interesting dynamic to the well-known argument that it's difficult to integrate a rising power into an established system. To the point about Southeast Asia is the most rapidly rising region with unsettled boundaries. So the need for a compelling, in my mind, the need for a compelling deterrent policy and strategy that's public, that's clear to everybody, is absolutely needed. If our relationship with China is going to continue to be as complex as it is, major economic partner while a major security concern, then there is a very compelling need for clarity in our policies and strategy and what we're doing to make sure that we don't move unknowingly or, apropos of a recent book about World War I, sleepwalk into something that we don't want. The differences are clear. It's okay to have differences. I think Secretary Hagel on his most recent visit to China was very clear about where we have differences. The Chinese officials were equally clear on their objection to our positions. Nobody broke economic relations. Nobody broke anything else. That's the type of conversation we need to have in the future.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment? Or?
Oh, no, I think that's... look, I think there's a paradox here that is going to be the paradox that sort of dominates the way in which the strategic conversation takes place. One is that every country in the region wants to engage a prosperous, happy, healthy, effective China. Every country in the region accepts the Chinese concerns that they ought to be respected and that they ought to have an opportunity for their views about regional security to have a reasonable sway in the minds of everyone in the region. But also everybody in the region is devoted to the idea that there is such a thing as a global commons, and that the global commons is there in a substantial geographic dimension in the South China Seas and in the East China Seas, and that the rules that have been established for the proper settlement of disputes and conduct in that zone are rules that ought to be applied, and that no resolution of the affairs in this region should take place by force majeure. So that having been said, there is only one country that can effectively ensure that the region's affairs are not settled by force majeure, and that's the United States. So there has to be a recognition in the part of both folk in the region that what the United States is prepared to do is critical. And there needs to be a recognition on the part of China that the countries in the region will look to the United States to ensure affairs are not settled by force majeure. Now this is, all these things are rather easy to say. How they then subsequently work out is another matter altogether. I think from the Australian point of view, and I suspect from the Japanese too, that there is a very strong sentiment that whatever needs to be done to ensure that the United States plays that sort of role is something that ought to be encouraged. If I was trying to say something to the Japanese about that, I think there are two things on the agenda at the moment which are going to determine the capacity of the United States to pursue effectively what it is that we want them to pursue. One sits in Congress with the question of sequestration and how the United States is allowed to manage its defence budget. The US has capacities on the drawing board as well as capacities already in existence, which will ensure that the United States plays that role in our lifetime. The second, frankly, is the TPP. Mm-hmm. The United States has to be able to conclude that agreement effectively. And that is something that Japan needs to give some very serious consideration to. In the negotiations to this point, Japan has been enormously helpful on the modern elements of the global trading agenda that are incorporated within the TPP discussion. Roles of SOEs, roles of intellectual property protection, roles of behind-the-border management of opportunities in the service sector and the like, and supply chains for businesses. Japan and the United has been enormously helpful in those negotiations. On the old agenda, and both new and old agenda, does have to be addressed. The Japanese need to think very carefully about the positions they're arriving at and protection of agriculture and protection of industrial production. If this fails, if the United States' involvement via the TPP, in the TPP and the outcome of the TPP fails, substantial damage will be done to the United States' position in the Asia-Pacific zone, which is the region we're talking about.
To the point on TPP, I would add a strong endorsement of it to the sense that the rebalance is perceived by a large percentage of the American public as being a purely military thing. That puts us at a decided disadvantage. And on the Congress side, as one voter, we need trade promotion authority very quickly out of our Congress if we're to make it, if we're to be a congenial negotiating partner for our international friends.
I would agree with that very much. Let me just add a word to that if I could, which is that I think TPP is important in two aspects here. One is that I think for Abenomics, the third arrow is closely tied to TPP.
Yes, that's right.
And my own hope would be, given Abe's very strong position in Japanese politics at this moment in time, it would be a good time to move forward to get an agreement on, at least between the U.S. and Japan, as to what Japan would be prepared to do. But then secondly, if the Japanese can come on board and we have a high quality agreement, and then the U.S. Congress does not ratify that agreement, the damage is very substantial. So there's a lot of work to do on both sides, and it's really, as much as anything else, a political set of issues and a matter of political will in each country that has to be demonstrated. With that, let's open it to the floor. You can please wait for a roving microphone to come to you, indicate who you are, your name, your affiliation, and then feel free to direct a question to one panelist or another if you wish. Back here, yes.
Thank you very much. Jeff Steinberg with MJS Associates. General Dempsey has frequently spoken about the fact that he views one of the major challenges and priorities for himself in the Asia-Pacific theater is to avoid what he calls the Thucydides trap, the almost inevitability of a conflict with China as China is rising and the United States is perceived in the region as perhaps at best a static power. And you know, the TPP issue, which all of you have referenced, is an area where I think many of us following events on Capitol Hill closely are deeply skeptical that it's going to go forward, at least fast track, in the period of the next year or so. My question is this. There seems to be a kind of unique and challenging situation with no historical precedent here. It's not like the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was never the largest holder of Western debt or largest trading partner. And so there's a kind of an asymmetry here between the Chinese economic thrust and at the same time legitimate concerns about the Chinese military flexing of muscle. I'd like to get your thoughts about how we address something, and is there a discussion that is really taking into account the fact that this is, I think, in many respects, a totally unprecedented challenge to not have the alliance developments be read in China as a hard containment that just sort of defeats General Dempsey's concern about not being sucked into the maelstrom of this Thucydides problem.
Well, I think it's a good thing that it is, as you rightly say, a totally new situation. Therefore, there's a limitation on people's temptation to draw false historical analogies. And that we need to recognise that we are in a situation which is totally new in global politics, in all the manifestations of power relationships. And one thing that you do have to note is that all countries in the region view sovereignty very strongly, and react very strongly to people who offend sovereignty. Those are lessons that need to be thought about in Beijing. I don't see inevitability in a clash with China in military terms at all. I think that the basic Chinese objectives for themselves into the foreseeable future is for their prosperous rise, and they know darn well a military confrontation with the United States or anyone else will not suit that. It's not a lesson they need to learn, it's a lesson that the Chinese understand. So that in that too lies a possibility for a good outcome in all these deliberations. The third thing is, I think that the American power, in both its military and its economic dimensions, the threats to American power are internal, not external. That the United States is, from what I know of American military capacities, United States, what it has on the drawing board and what it is beginning to bring into place is further ahead of any other country's military capability now than it was 10 years ago. The United States is not going backwards, it's going forward at a rapid rate. But the threat to that being manifest as American capability lies within the realm of the American defence budget and how the American defence budget is handled. And that is a determination for the American political system, not for anybody else. Likewise on the economy. If the United States recognises that the middle class that it now needs to engage to drive growth is not so much its own, and in the past there's been an enormous generation of American growth via domestic consumption. Now it's via the consumption of other people's middle classes. And the other people's middle classes happen to be the middle classes of the region that we're talking about.
Thank you, Mark.
Just a, I don't know, so a factoid or whatever, there was an earlier mention of the people-to-people dimension of all of this, and it's worth thinking about its significance, and the factoid simply familiar to many people in the room. Currently, there are, I think, rough number, 250,000 Chinese college and university students, graduate students, in the United States, including the daughter of Xi Jinping. Now, these represent future Chinese elite. What does that do to the texture of U.S.-Chinese relations going forward? is a question. But having myself, just personal experience, having spent a year in a Chinese school as an undergraduate, that's a transformative thing. So, this is a infinitely complex relationship, and it's got the economic and all the rest of it, but it's also got this huge people-to-people personal element in it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chris Nelson.
Thanks very much, Ken. Chris Nelson, the Nelson Report. I wanted to build on part of that question just heard that was really, in a way, first raised by our friend from Taiwan TV, and that is, do the Chinese begin to comprehend now that so much of what's happening with our various allies, and so much of what President Obama had to say and do on his trip is because of Chinese actions, and not, as Marvin reminded us, because of the speech that Hillary gave at the Hanoi ARF in 2010. Sometimes the Chinese narrative is that you Americans started all the trouble, that's why everybody's reacting. My question, given this panel and your expertise, is from Obama's trip and the things he had to say, are we hearing the need for a more explicit diplomacy from our friends and allies in Asia and Southeast Asia, from them to Beijing, to say, guys, what's happening here is because of what you're doing, not because of what the Americans are doing. They are doing what they're doing by request, our request. Is that a way to approach trying to help our Chinese friends see what the dynamic is here? Otherwise, everything that happens proves to them that we are actually trying to contain them, and it just keeps going downhill. Thank you.
Ken, you ought to take that one on.
Well, this was.
Yeah, okay.
Kim,
Well,
why don't you go first?
I enjoy your newsletter, Chris. It goes from strength to strength. It's terrific. Look, I think all countries in the region do, in fact, quietly, some overtly, make their views, their fears, their concerns known to the Chinese. I don't think you need to worry. Sometimes they do it quite spectacularly, like the Indonesian Defence Minister did a few days ago. But they all do. It's all part of the conversation. And the Chinese are understanding of it. They engage it. They have as difficult an agenda on their plates as to how they approach these things in the interaction of what happens in the zone and what happens to their claims with their domestic politics. They've got to think those issues through too. Because these things are, as it's been indicated by the other speakers and the questioners, so sui generis, so new, these things are being thought through and felt out. I don't think that you're going to see a conflict as a product of any deliberation on the part of anybody in the region. I cite one exception to that, where the Chinese really do need to think through their position more carefully is not necessarily in the maritime areas. It's in relation to Korea. North Korea is beginning to build up a very dangerous position. A very dangerous position which might, if it went through to its fruition, produce quite a serious situation between it and the other powers in the region. The most dramatic military development on the western side, if you like, between the United States and Japan is the ballistic missile defence shield, which is being built up. That's not being built up vis-a-vis China, it's being built up vis-a-vis North Korea. And that is something the Chinese have every reason to object to and be frustrated by and annoyed with. But it is entirely a product of the North Koreans not responding to the international pressures that are there upon them. That's something that the Chinese need to think about very, very carefully, because all developments in relation to it are not in their interests.
Just very quickly.
Just real quick, just again, a sort of a factoid on Chris's point, and I'm also a fan of the newsletter. I don't know, 3 years ago or so, the Singaporeans have been particularly, I would say, articulate on the point that Chris raises about speaking to the Chinese. You need to understand this about the reaction of others. And Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister, visited China, gave a talk at the party school, and basically gave a very, very fine smart, intelligent lecture to the emerging Chinese leadership saying, this is what you need to understand about the Americans. One little aspect of that was, oh, by the way, there have been a whole bunch of ethnic Chinese that have gotten Nobel Prizes in various, scientific disciplines and so on. Also, by the way, they were all American citizens. Maybe that tells you something.
Yeah, that Americans control who gets the Nobel Prize.
I forgot.
Last question, and we need to make it very short. I've gone to the middle of the room several times. Is there? Yes, over here. I'm sorry, is there a microphone we can get there quickly? Thank you.
That's a very athletic performance. I'm deeply impressed.
Man. Am I on?
And now you're on, yes.
All right. Guy Thomas, Sea Sigma Center, spent a long time in Japan, in the Navy and with the Air Force too. I'm struck that nobody has mentioned India today, and that seems to me to be a major card that's being played several different ways. Do any of you care to talk about how the India, China, Japan, Singapore relationship is being handled, and where do you see that going?
You're the expert, Marvin.
Not on India. I'll just say this, and I'm on thin ice here. This is not an area of the expertise in depth. The Indians, there is a cadre of very sophisticated geopolitical realists in the Indian security establishment that very much want to play in the new great game in Southeast Asia, South China Sea, China. They see India as the primordial, eternal rival of China for primacy in Asia. The Indians' problem is not their desire to become part of this, it's capacity. And it's the internal sclerotic, paralysis of the Indian bureaucracy and all of that. And my general sense is that many of us sort of have aspirations for the Indians to become a real force in this arena. The Singaporeans, for example, would love to have the Indians in that kind of a role. The Indians have been very slow to rise to that, not because they don't want to, they just are having a lot of trouble doing it.
There's another trilateral series ongoing, U.S., Japan, India, that alternates in Tokyo, New Delhi, and Quantico, Virginia, to let you know what some of the thinking is.
I hope you will all join me in thanking our panelists for a very wide-ranging discussion.